Okay, I'm going to be discussing an article in this epistemology anthology. It's a very important article, and I think this is Evidentialism, an article written by Richard Feldman and Earl Conee, published in the journal called Philosophical Studies 48 in 1985, and I did one other article by these two, and that was called Internalism Defended. And in that article, they do defend internalism as opposed to externalism. They defend internalist theories of empirical knowledge generally. However, in this article, they defend a certain kind of internalist theory of empirical knowledge, specifically that is called evidentialism. Evidentialism is an internalist theory of empirical knowledge that states that the notion of empirical justification is one that is gained by that of evidence. It's not like reliabilism, which says that things are about belief-forming processes. It's not having to do with, it doesn't really have to do with truths, believing truths, or responsible action as much, but it emphasizes the fact of the believer or the person having evidence for what he or she believes in, and that the person having evidence for what they believe in is that of responsible action, epistemically. But basically, these are a few concerns about evidentialism that they bring up that I'll get to here in a second. Feldman and Conee kind of bring up this proposition called EJ, which is basically this thing I have boxed in red here, which is the outline of what evidentialism is, which says doxastic attitude D towards proposition P is epistemically justified for S at T if and only if having D towards P fits the evidence S has at T. So a doxastic attitude towards a proposition means that you can have one of three things. You can believe that it's true, you can believe that it's false, or you can believe that it's reasonable, unreasonable, whatever formulation you want to go with. You can believe one of three things about any proposition. You can believe that it's of course true and false, or the first two of those three things that you can have towards a proposition: true or false, reasonable or unreasonable, rational or irrational, stuff like that. The third one is that you are declining to have a attitude towards it. You are simply denying its justification, or you are suspending its status. You are not giving it a bivalent value of true or false, or rational or irrational. So that's kind of the idea of what a doxastic attitude is. But this is kind of just saying that a certain doxastic attitude towards a proposition is justified for the person at a certain time if and only if having that certain doxastic attitude towards P fits the evidence that you have for T. So kind of like, if I have a cup full of coffee in front of me, and I say, well, this cup has coffee in it. That would mean that I have evidence for that proposition, and I can have a certain doxastic attitude toward it, which is favorable to it. That's true, or it's reasonable, or it's rational, or whatever you want to say. However, so basically saying that the proposition, this cup has coffee in it, is one that and you can have a doxastic attitude towards that which is justified, and you have evidence which fits that because of your current mental state of perception of seeing the cup with the coffee in it. However, if you're saying if you have a proposition which is there's a pink unicorn over there, however, you have no evidence to fit it. This is pretty simple. You have no evidence which states that there's a pink unicorn that exists in some place in space-time. Then you don't really have the evidence which fits the doxastic attitude of true or reasonable of that proposition. Thus, that's the typical formula for justifying beliefs. And I'm inclined to agree with it, if I were to argue a epistemic position, it would be a internalist, evidentialist one, similar to the one that these two advocate. Epistemic justification depends on cognitive capacities of people / information gatherers. So it's not about belief forming processes. It's not about mental states are not what are somewhat of being is what is being emphasized here. But it depends upon not upon processes or virtues of how you came upon that belief, but based upon basically your mental state and how that matches up with what you believe. Epistemic justification depends upon cognitive capacities of people or information gatherers, which are basically usually the same thing. So, what is doxastic voluntarism? That is one objection out of a few, and there are still some things I'm leaving out. Like they name a lot of different objections to their form of evidentialism, but I'm going to kind of discuss a couple of these few here. Doxastic voluntarism states that there are cases where a person has no control of their doxastic attitudes of certain propositions. So the question here is it always the case that when you have a doxastic attitude towards a proposition that you have control over it? Are you voluntarily giving that doxastic attitude? Is it always a voluntary thing? That's the big question. Feldman and Conee kind of say that it can occur where you have a doxastic attitude towards a proposition where it's predisposed and you don't really have control over it. However, that doesn't really do anything towards their form of evidentialism. It doesn't really hurt it. So he says the question is are there involuntarily adopted attitudes? Are the statuses of beliefs under control of the believer? Beliefs are involuntary, and can there be beliefs that are involuntary and under epistemic evaluation? Does epistemic justification have to do with an assessment of a person? Feldman kind of say no, but the issue is that even though that there are involuntary adopted doxastic attitudes, that this doesn't really hurt their theory, because this thing can be applied towards doxastic attitudes this can be applied to doxastic attitudes about propositions which were involuntarily adopted. So basically, a person deserves praise or blame if the state is under the person's control. And the question about doxastic limits, and this is a kind of question of from Alvin Goldman. Is it appropriate to set epistemic standards beyond normal limits? And it's questions. He says that epistemology should be giving guides for setting beliefs. Goldman is a renowned externalist in epistemology. I have a couple of different videos on him and a few of his articles. He advocated a causal theory of knowing in the 60s, and he also advocated process reliabilism. I think he still does. No, right now he's kind of he still is on the externalist side of things. However, he does is kind of more thinking on the lines of scientific and evolutionary epistemology. So the question about doxastic limits. The objection is that there's no basis that the premise that what is epistemically justified must be restricted to feasible alternatives. So, are forming and justifying beliefs always within cognitive limits? That's the question. Does this always happen within cognitive limits? The externalist card is just that. The externalists play the card that, not all the propositions or beliefs that we adopt, or the attitudes that we adopt about our beliefs, are from within our cognitive capacity. So that's kind of the card that they play, that it's external, that it's outside of what our cognitive capacity is. So the question here is from Goldman, does this cover everything, and is it appropriate to make a set which guides your justification of your beliefs, which doesn't account for things that could, or attitudes and beliefs which could come from and be of things that are outside of one's cognitive capacity of the person or information gatherer. Feldman and Conee say that epistemic justification and having to do with these two things don't really hurt the whole theory. Those two things don't hurt their theory at all. And epistemic justification sets an epistemic standard for evaluating the doxastic conduct. This sets the standard. And what Goldman says about such evidentialist theories, but doxastic limits, doesn't really hurt their cause or their position. Okay, thirdly, justification and obligation to believe truths, and this is from Roderick Chisholm. Chisholm says that one must have intellectual requirement to try one's best to believe all and only the truth. And so basically Chisholm has a similar evidentialist thing, which has basically a version of this, but with corollaries inside of there that say that you have to bring it about that you believe that you believe the truth. So he wants to basically have a guide of doxastic conduct which makes sure that you believe the truth, and makes it and basically includes the fact that you try your best to bring it about that what you're believing is the truth, and that if you believe anything false, that you should bring it down from its justificatory status. Believing one's evidence, according to Feldman and Conee, is basically that. It basically is believing as much as you can, or having what you believe be as close to the truth as possible. So believing one's evidence and guiding and basically this being a guide for doxastic conduct, your beliefs are being justified based on your evidence that you have at your mental disposal, is basically this: obligation to believe the truth. Obligation to believe things and justify things based on your evidence is basically in itself your obligation to believe the truth. Feldman and Conee mentioned Chisholm's little thing like this, a little proposition, which is a guide of doxastic conduct, is, according to Feldman and Conee, just like this, but with different words, and it includes bringing it about that you're going to believe the truth, trying your best to believe the truth, and they hint at Feldman and Conee hint at the ambiguity of trying one's best to. And I would also agree that it's ambiguous in a proposition for doxastic conduct to include trying one's best, because that's kind of a difficult thing to include there. Epistemically justified attitudes are not the same here. But what they are saying is that this is basically what Chisholm is saying. This is a obligation to believe things based on your evidence is basically in itself a obligation to believe the truth, and a effort to make your guide for your doxastic conduct to include obligations to believe the truth is kind of not really that helpful, because it's kind of all the same. I mean, it isn't, but in doing this and trying to make something like this, which guides your believing, which guides your process of belief forming and your process of belief justification, it's not really helping. Fourthly, justification and epistemically responsible acts. That's from Hilary Cornblith. This kind of is Cornblith's. He had a writing where, I forget what it's called. He hinted that, kind of talking about internalist and evidentialist theories of knowledge, that that one must include the obligation to act responsibly when you're dealing with your beliefs, to epistemically act responsibly, as in not adopt beliefs which are irresponsible for you to hold, and that justification or lack thereof can be attained by a belief not being adopted responsibly. Cornblith says that one should gather evidence in a epistemically responsible way, to avoid epistemically culpable ignorance. Kind of talks about the physicist here, where let's say we have a group of scientists. This is Hornbluth's example. You have a group of scientists where a physicist has a big theory which he plans on publishing, where another scientist in the group points out a huge flaw, and basically ruins his whole theory, ruins everything. But the physicist is gonna not listen, and is gonna keep on going. Basically, that is what Hornbluth is characterizing as epistemically culpable ignorance. So basically, if you are that physicist and you have one of your scientists say, and you have one of the other scientists point out a big flaw in your theory, then you can no longer responsibly believe some of the things that were in your theory. What else? Beliefs can be unjustified if they result from epistemically irresponsible behavior. And Feldman and Conee say that evidentialism can't accommodate this. And, well, Hornbluth says that evidentialism cannot accommodate the epistemically responsible action part of this, that little corollary. So Chisholm and Hornbluth are trying to add corollaries to make this whole thing better. And they're both trying to hint at that evidentialism has difficulty accommodating such further restrictions. According to Feldman and Conee, justified beliefs can result from epistemically irresponsible actions. There are lots of different cases given by epistemologists which can show that, given the Gettier cases. If you read Edmund Gettier's paper, is justified true belief knowledge, that can show you that it's possible for there to be, well, that's probably not a good example, because in the Gettier example, it was responsible for Jones to believe in those things, or whoever we're talking about. But there are many examples that I cannot bring up. I cannot think of an exact example where someone believes something irresponsibly. Oh, Bonger's clairvoyance cases, where in many of those cases it is irresponsible for the clairvoyant to believe in what they believe based on their clairvoyant power. But they still believed it, and it happened to be true. So it's possible for something to be justified, even though it was come upon or adopted in a epistemically irresponsible way. And thus, and if that's true, this little restriction doesn't really do a whole lot. And finally, I kind of want to talk about the whole, kind of almost like a opponent to evidentialism, which is reliabilism. Reliabilism, like I said, is a theory of external empirical knowledge, which states that justification comes from having gotten your beliefs through reliable belief processes. Now there are different varieties of reliabilism. Like for Goldman and others, you have process reliabilism, and you also have virtue reliabilism. But kind of this is the externalism versus internalism kind of split, and typically they're going to fall on one of these two sides, and sometimes on one of these two. So the whole thing here is Feldman and Conee have been arguing this and trying to take care of these objections. Plus, they state a lot of different other ones, and that it kind of is a somewhat long article, so I couldn't include everything here. However, if you have a question about something, or have a question about something that I've included here, or if you think I